welcome back to another episode of Talking Out of Line. As you all know, this is a show about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging across different industries in the United States. On today's episode, we'll be talking about conversations and DEIB. We'll be speaking to one of the authors of the new book on DEIB called Say the Right Thing: How to Talk About Identity, Diversity, and Justice.
Dave Glasgow is the Executive Director of the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. Alongside this, he is also an adjunct professor at the NYU School of Law. His work for the Meltzer Center is based on creating and executing educational programs for a variety of companies, including Fortune 500 companies. He's written for many different publications, including the Harvard Business Review, HuffPost, Slate, and served as an associate director of the Public Interest Law Center at NYU School of Law prior to his current role.
Kenji Yoshino, who's the co-author, is currently a law professor at NYU School of Law, as well as the faculty director of the Meltzer Center of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at NYU. Before arriving at NYU, he worked as a professor in Yale University. Say the Right Thing is his fourth published book upon its release in February 2023. Alongside his books, he has published in many academic journals as well as mainstream print media, such as LA Times and New York Times. He also has a passion for public speaking and can be seen speaking in television programs such as NPR, CNN, PBS, to name just a few.
Their related passions for diversity, inclusion, and belonging, alongside their relations as colleagues at NYU, brought Yoshino and Glasgow together to write this book, Say the Right Thing. It's described as a shame-free guide to navigating conversations across our differences at a time of rapid social change. This book also talks about difficult topics to speak about, such as race, gender, LGBTQ, and they try to break the unspoken tension that is felt and urge people to have these conversations in order to progress society to become more inclusive. Yoshino and Glasgow aim to find and hopefully make new allies to help evolve society into creating a more inclusive world. Award-winning actress, singer Vanessa Williams reviewed this book as diversity is a fact, but inclusion is a choice. This book is an utterly transformative guide to building an inclusive culture, one conversation at a time.
As always, before jumping into the interview with David Glasgow, let's look at some statistics on conversation and DEIB. 55% of people are too scared to talk about diversity and inclusion in the workplace for fear of saying the wrong thing. Language relating to diversity, equity, inclusion, which in short is called DEI, in scientific publications has increased by 4,200% between 2010 and 2021. 55% of more educated Americans who have at least some college education or more were slightly more supportive of teaching about how racism continues to impact American society compared to those with a high school degree or less, which is 48%.
While LGBTQ women make up 2.3% of entry-level employees, they comprise only 1.6% of managers and even smaller shares of more senior levels. Compared with straight women and straight men, bisexual women are 13 and 28% points, respectively, more likely to have experienced microaggressions.
Of 400 companies with 100,000 employees, each cited an average loss per company of $62.4 million per year because of inadequate communication to and between employees. 92% of business leaders agree a strategic workforce education program should help an organization achieve its diversity and inclusion goals. It'll be really interesting now to delve deep into the conversation of conversations and DEIB with David Glasgow at Talking Out of Line. Hi all, welcome to another episode of Talking Out of Line. Today we have with us David Glasgow, Executive Director of Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at NYU School of Law, and co-authored of our featured book of DEIB called Say the Right Thing. Thank you so much, David, for being with us and telling us a little bit about yourself, the amazing work that you do at the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, and of course, the book that's about to come out in February 7th.
Well, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
So tell me a little bit about yourself, what got you to this world of DEIB, and a bit about the projects that you're involved in, including the book.
Absolutely. So I grew up in Australia and became a lawyer there. So I practiced anti-discrimination law and employment law. And then I moved over to the United States about a decade ago and did a master's degree at NYU, and then ultimately pivoted from the law into this field of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And the main driver for me to do that is, if I can make a confession to you, I was never really that interested in practicing law. I was much more interested in social justice and inclusion and what helps drive those outcomes. And to me, as a young person, I thought, well, the law is a good option for advancing social justice and inclusion. And I still very much believe that. But as soon as I found this field of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, I immediately thought, this is where I belong, because I'm much more interested in those everyday conversations, interactions, how we treat each other inside organizations, classrooms, workplaces. And that's the core of what so much of this work entails, is those daily interactions. And I wanted to move over into that field.
Well, I'd like to challenge you a little bit into thinking that I think the legal profession can actually bring in so much to the world of DEIB and the expertise that you have, because knowing the legal realities and the legal rights from being a lawyer is priceless when it comes to the rights and the progress that can be made for making life easier when it comes to DEIB challenges and solving them, right? And on the other hand, I can also imagine that the legal world can have such a huge contribution because of that reason into the world of DEIB. So while it's unrelated, I think it's just an amazing asset that you have.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And I totally agree. And oftentimes when we work with organizations, the DEI people and the legal people sort of work together, sometimes in tension with each other. Sometimes the legal people are pushing back on what the DEI people want to do. And so I think it's very important to bring those two fields into conversation with each other.
Absolutely. So please give us some highlights of your work and your center's work. What are the kind of projects that you're involved in, and a little bit about how the book came into being?
Yeah, so as a center, we work a lot with within the law school. So we teach courses to students on leadership, diversity, and inclusion, and we offer a speaker series. We bring in leading thinkers on DEIB to the law school. But we also work a lot with organizations outside of the law school on diversity and inclusion initiatives. So for example, we built an allyship training module for Microsoft that's now part of its global employee training. We work with law firms on similar kinds of initiatives. And we recently did a big project with the nonprofit organization Black Theatre United on a project to diversify and make more inclusive the Broadway theater industry, where we facilitated a summit and drafted a document that leaders in the industry signed on to make reforms on Broadway. So we do a broad range of work. It's not really always in the law, but a lot of it is working with external organizations on helping them build more inclusive cultures.
Who would have thought that we'd have an overlap here? So one of the work that I'm doing is actually with Front Row Productions, which is the oldest Black-run Broadway production house. And one of the guests of the first episode, I believe, of Talking Out of Line was this CEO of Front Row Productions, speaking about Broadway and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So we definitely have overlaps in that as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I feel like the theater and the arts and the entertainment industry is such an important driver of these conversations as well. So that's great.
Absolutely. So tell me a bit about what diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging mean to you as a person with their legal hat, as well as a hat in running a center that is really doing such multifaceted work with industry and academia on the field of DEIB.
Yeah, so to me, all of these terms are kind of circling around the same sort of theme of really trying to create both organizations and a society where everyone, regardless of their identity or background, can truly thrive and succeed and be themselves and be authentic in those environments. And so diversity, of course, as many of your listeners know, is often about actual representation, how many people from particular backgrounds and identities are represented inside an organization. And inclusion is so much of how those individuals are treated by people within the organization. Belonging, to me, is a lot of the outcome of how people feel when they are included, that they feel like they have a stake in the organization, that the organization has a stake in them. And equity is about treatment of ensuring that everyone has a fair shot at succeeding, right? So sometimes that requires people all getting the same treatment. Sometimes that requires taking into account people's different circumstances and the barriers that they might face to actually give them other opportunities that might not be afforded to some people to give them that fair shot. So to me, all of these terms, though, are really getting at the idea that everybody, regardless of their background and identity, deserves a shot to succeed and to thrive.
Thank you. Those are, I never tire of listening to people's similar but different yet definitions of DEIB, because that's why I like having that question out there for my guests, and as well as for me and for the audience, because I feel like every time someone defines it, they do it a little bit with their own twist.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like that. So that's great. So
Great.
tell me now, is this all an accident, all this amazing work that you do, or is it an intentional choice that you made from your career starting out?
Initially, it was an accident because I came across this field through work that I was doing with Kenji Yoshino, who's my co-author on the book. So I was his student a long, long time ago now, and was working with him on a project relating to marriage equality. And he introduced me to this field of DEIB. So I didn't seek it out initially, but I sort of fell in love with it as soon as I heard about it, because it seemed to really combine a lot of the interest I had in social justice and inclusion, a little bit of the legal skills that I had as an anti-discrimination employment lawyer in the way that you were talking about, but really taking me off in that new direction. But ever since I've kind of entered this field, I've really loved it.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So I wanted to ask you now a few questions that specifically talk about your book, Say the Right Thing, which, by the way, I noticed in the back this amazing. So let's start by asking, what's that painting about?
So yeah, the little painting, the product placement that I have behind me is a little poster of the book cover that our publisher designed for us for the book. So it has a lot of little people all walking around and interacting with each other and not interacting with each other. It kind of looks like an image of I guess people at Times Square or something, from all different identities and backgrounds all interacting. And we loved the idea of a cover like this because it really speaks to the full sort of diversity of human beings that exist in the world, and the idea that we're all trying to live together and figure out ways to interact with each other.
Sounds good. I love your cover too, and I've had the privilege of reading your book, and I think it's amazing. So, I know you've told us a little bit about why you wrote this book in the beginning, but I'd like to know how did the collaboration come about with your co-author?
Yeah, so Kenji and I, he's a faculty director of the center, and so he and I had been working a lot with organizations, and a huge barrier that we kept encountering in our work with organizations was that people were just terrified of saying the wrong thing, and across all walks of life, anywhere from senior corporate executives through to students across all generations. And so what we thought was, well, this is a real shame, because a lot of these people are people who could be showing up as allies. They could be participating in efforts to drive a more inclusive culture, but they're hiding under their desks in fear of getting it wrong. And so we wanted to write a book that would give people practical tools for having these conversations more effectively, so that they could overcome their fear and actually participate more in what we think are critical conversations driving equity and inclusion.
Sounds good. So what I wanted to ask you also is, I think you already answered a little bit about my next question, but I'd like to know a little bit more, that why do you think it's harder and harder for people to have these kind of conversations now about identity, about differences, and how we can sort of work together to on our differences?
I think a big part of the challenge that a lot of people are experiencing, if they belong to members of more kind of dominant or majority groups in society, is a combination of changing demographics and activism around identity issues. So these conversations have always been incredibly challenging if you belong to a marginalized group, right? But I think what's changed is that because the profile of the United States is changing, there are, more immigrants, more people of color, more LGBTQ people, et cetera. And those groups are really combining and getting louder and more powerful in their activism around these issues across all sorts of social movements. If you think of Me Too or Black Lives Matter or Stop Asian Hate or any of these movements, what that's led to is a situation where all of a sudden people from more dominant social groups who might have been able to ignore these issues in the past or treat them as fringe, all of a sudden they're confronted directly with having to respond to these issues. So they're in a workplace and all of a sudden the people that they're managing are speaking up and saying, hey, I don't really like the way that I was just treated now. Or someone in a classroom says, why is the syllabus for this course all white men? Or whatever it is, whether you're in the workplace, in the family, with your friends, these conversations are just happening more and more. And as a result, even people from groups that could previously ignore them are finding them intensely uncomfortable. And I think that's a really big part of why this challenge is especially acute right now.
Right. And I also want to sort of bring it to the audience's attention that not only are the fringe groups making themselves loud and clear, but at the same time, I feel that there's just a lot of intergenerational stuff, I think, that's going on. Because there is so much of a difference in communication styles. I find, being an educator myself and a researcher myself and doing this work, that there is just such a different value system for sort of Gen X versus Gen Z versus millennials, and like how we value challenging and coming out with conversations. So I think there's like an intergenerational and a very big potential there in having some work to be done through the generational conversational patterns that can be brought up.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I'm really glad that you brought that up because it's so much more than just the fact that language is changing. So, of course, younger generations are always going to bring new terms to the table to describe themselves or to describe forms of injustice that they're experiencing. It's also, as you say, a different mindset, a different set of values around a lot of these issues. And I think that's driving some of the fear and some of the conflict, especially among older generations who are unsure how to navigate some of these conversations effectively.
Right. And think about the example that I'm sure you faced at NYU, that when I'm teaching, I really find it interesting how many students are willing to talk about mental health breakdowns and or mental health issues, which would be unthinkable. Like no one spoke about mental health even when I was in college, which was in the early 2000s. So even that has changed. So the generational ability to speak about things that have not been spoken about before is really just moving in that direction, which I think the generations that came before would find it harder and harder to deal with. So we definitely need a book like this is what I'm trying to get at.
Absolutely. And I think another good example of that is gender identity, where I feel like even a decade ago, so much of the language around transgender identity, non-binary identity, et cetera, was really unfamiliar to people. And I think there's still a lot of catching up that we're doing as a culture to try to understand that.
Exactly. So you write in the book that no one can afford to sit out these conversations anymore. Fully agree. But why is that? And why would you think so, to let our audiences know from your perspective, of course?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is what I was describing before about how changing demographics and activism have really made these conversations inescapable. So if you think about where we spend our time in our lives, right, we go through schools. These days, even in K through 12 education, there's a lot more conversations happening around DEIB issues. Sometimes it's, of course, controversial with the whole so-called critical race theory debate that we've seen playing out at a political level, but other times it's just a lot more programming.
Located in certain states in the United States, of course.
Yes, exactly. And so these conversations are happening as early as, elementary school in some cases, maybe even earlier in daycares and preschools. Sometimes people are talking about diversity issues, but then they're carrying through to universities and workplaces where now more and more and more organizations, as you know, have chief diversity officers, have programming around They have committees on women's leadership or racial equity or discussions of privilege or implicit bias trainings or what have you. So I feel like it's very hard to function as a member of society now and not bump up against these conversations at least sometimes. Even if you just open your daily news feed, you are going to see conversations in the media around issues of identity, diversity, and justice. And so if you go to a family barbecue, people are going to bring that up and say, well, what do you think about cancel culture? Or what do you think about whatever the topic is? And so I think these days, it might have been possible a few decades ago for people to just focus on their work and ignore these issues. I think now, whether you're in the workplace, an educational setting, or even, as I said, a family barbecue, you're going to encounter these conversations eventually.
Sounds good. So why might people who belong to disadvantaged social groups, actually advantaged social groups, whether based on race or gender or sexual orientation, get defensive or evasive if someone points out a misstep? And how can they train themselves to not have that kind of a knee-jerk reaction to wanting to say the right thing and or doing the right thing?
Yeah, so these conversations can trigger really intense emotional discomfort because, if you belong to an advantaged social group and someone from a marginalized group says, hey, what you just said, I found sexist, or it offended me in some way, or what have you, the immediate reaction that I think a lot of us feel to hearing that is, oh my God, they're saying that I'm a terrible person, right? Sort of listing out all of the ways in which you feel accused of being a bad person. And that triggers all sorts of moral identity questions for you. But even if you don't think you've been directly accused of being a bad person, you could interpret the statement to be suggesting that you are benefiting from someone else's disadvantage in some way, that you have privilege in life, or that you're ignoring the suffering of other groups. And all of that, again, suggests that perhaps you're doing something wrong, or that there's something wrong with you, or at least that's how it can sound to people who are on the receiving end of those conversations. And so I think one of the really important skills to develop is the skill of resilience, to actually be able to ground yourself emotionally in these conversations, to hear what someone else is saying to you without kind of breaking down in your own sort of puddle of discomfort. And so there are a lot of different ways that you can build that resilience, but let me just sort of highlight one, and then happy to go into more detail if you'd like me to. I think a really, really critical foundational step is to try to adopt a growth mindset in these conversations to overcome a fixed mindset. So many people, of course, will be familiar with the psychologist Carol Dweck's work on fixed mindsets and growth mindsets, where a fixed mindset is where you believe that your skills, your abilities are innate and they're never going to change. And a growth mindset being the attitude that if I put in effort and practice, I can improve my skills and my abilities. The social psychologist Dolly Chugh points out that in this area of DEIB, people so often get stuck in that fixed mindset because the consequences of failure feel catastrophic, right? If I make a mistake when I'm playing the piano, it doesn't mean that I'm a terrible person. Whereas if I make a mistake in DEIB, it can feel like I'm a terrible person. And so we get stuck in this fixed mindset. And so what I really want people to do is try to carry over that growth mindset attitude that they would apply in other areas of their life, whether it is learning a musical instrument or a foreign language or a new skill at work, and apply that same mindset over here, where they don't treat mistakes as a reflection of their moral character. They treat mistakes as an opportunity to learn. So rather than berating yourself or getting mad or saying, how dare this person say this to me, the reaction would instead be, oh, I messed up. Thanks for letting me know. Let me learn that, and then I'll try better next time. And I think that kind of a growth mindset is one extremely important way of keeping yourself more emotionally grounded in these conversations.
So it's interesting because we agree on the approach that you just gave, and the way I say it in my own words to my audience, to anyone I work with on these issues, is we need to, it's like growing a muscle. just like going to the gym and we grow muscles, and you just need to it just doesn't happen overnight. You need to actually work hard at it, grow the muscle, and get more and more you just need to get better at becoming stronger in this work and this field and what you do, and you have to start watching your reactions, and you can't make it about yourself when you are microaggressing and or creating an issue for someone else. So
Right.
oftentimes what I see is if someone does something wrong, a lot of times we get into this mentality that, oh my God, like now I have to cry such big tears, crocodile tears, to make it about me during the time when actually I'm the one who microaggressed or whatever. So the idea is, the learning is, we are not part of the fixed mindset. So the muscle, the same idea, which is we need to grow the muscle and be willing to put in the work, and also not take away the moment of acknowledging it, because we need to be understanding of our emotional responses to things. That when is it the right time to not make it about ourselves? And if we do
Yes.
something, and what is the right thing to do when we are the ones who have messed up, and not making our emotional breakdown as being the center point of it, which I see happen all the time. And it's something
Yes.
I intentionally bring up in the workshop and the works and the, like, I mean, whatever work, consulting, workshops, training, teaching, whatever I'm doing in this world, that becomes like a really big part of the lesson, which people don't understand.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So, and I've read a really amazing article a couple of years ago that actually had written that out, that a lot of people of historically marginalized groups actually stopped going to majority white workplaces that are even very woke and left leaning, and who consider themselves to be anti-racist and everything, because sometimes when they're in these meetings, white groups often make it about their emotional breakdown about, say, slavery or racism.
Mm-hmm.
And then people of historically marginalized groups often feel that it is not really their place to be emotionally unloading, and it takes away from the attention of the actual issue that we need to solve, which is the issue that is affecting historically marginalized groups. Was I able to explain myself?
Absolutely. And I love the muscle growing metaphor, because I think what that
Students get
also,
it. They love it. Go to the gym, grow a muscle. It doesn't.
yes. And I think, and I think what that conveys really well is that discomfort is actually a really important part of growth, because you don't actually grow muscles if you feel totally comfortable in the gym, right? You only grow the muscle by actually working it hard enough that you are feeling that pang of discomfort.
Right.
And I think these conversations are very similar. You can't grow in these conversations if you're never going to ever feel uncomfortable when you're having them, right? And
Right.
and the point you made about the crying, I mean, that sort of leads to another aspect of resilience here, which is we think that it's okay to feel the emotional turmoil or the pain that you might be feeling in that conversation. But what's really important is that you don't dump out that emotion to the person who is
Yes.
actually you're trying to help in that environment, right? Or who needs the sort of support. So there's a thing we use to describe in the book called ring theory, which was developed by the psychologist Susan Silk, where she had an experience of being diagnosed with cancer, and she was in the hospital, and a friend wanted to visit her, and she said, "Oh, please don't visit me because I don't really feel like having visitors in the hospital." And the friend said to her, "Well, this isn't just about you, Susan. I want to visit you." And Susan thought, well, hang on a second. How is my cancer not about me? And so she developed this ring theory where she said, look, if someone's going through a crisis, imagine them being in the center of a circle and then drawing a series of concentric circles around that person. And so in the middle center circle, put the person in crisis, and then one ring out, put the friend or a family member of that person in crisis, and then another ring out from that, put that person's friends and family members, right? So each layer has like one step removed from the person in the center. And her point is comfort in and dump out. So if you've got bad feelings, you're allowed to comfort into the center of the circle, but if you have the negative feelings, dump them out to someone on the outer circle. So Susan Silk's friend was allowed to feel upset or annoyed that she couldn't visit her in the hospital. It's just that she shouldn't have cried her tears to Susan, the cancer patient, about it. They can get that support from their own friends or their own spouse. And I think so often people make that mistake in this work, right? If you are a white person who's feeling really upset about slavery, rather than making the whole conversation about you and crying in front of everyone and turning all the attention away from the issue onto yourself, why not go home that evening to your spouse and talking to them about the painful emotions that you're experiencing so that you're not dumping that out to the people who are most directly affected?
Absolutely. And I think that this whole conversation can be really difficult, but I think it's an important one to have because the theory that you were speaking about is exactly on point to what I was talking about. So now, moving on to a really interesting topic that will get people's attention, which is cancel culture. So, you and your co author feel that we should hit the pause button on cancel culture. Why do you argue for this?
Yeah, so of course there are going to be instances where it is important to cancel people. So we certainly don't think no matter what mistake someone makes, you should always treat them generously. So if someone has engaged in, egregious behavior, sexual harassment, bigotry, etc., it's going to be appropriate to cancel them. But what we want to do for the sort of run of the mill case is recognize that all of us, literally all of us, from time to time, are going to be a source of non-inclusive behavior, right? We're all going to make a mistake in these conversations sometimes. And so what we want to do is build a culture where people who make those mistakes are given the grace to grow from them, are given the opportunity to grow. And one of the reasons that we want to do that is because our book is directed at allies. So people who belong to majority or dominant groups in society. And we think there's a real opportunity for allies because they're not directly affected. They're not the target of the bias, right, themselves. So I would never say to someone, oh, let's say you're a woman of color and you've experienced a racist or sexist comment. You need to be really generous back to the person who just treated you with that racism and sexism because you're directly targeted by that comment. So that's not on you, right? Whereas I do think that if you're an ally coming into that situation, if you are not the target of the comment, you have a real opportunity to pull that person aside who made the comment and actually give them the tools to grow from that mistake. So rather than coming in and immediately condemning and canceling them for it, that looks like separating the behavior from the person. So focusing on the impact of what the person's behavior was on the other person, rather than saying things that suggest that they're a terrible person for having done what they did. And also sharing your own growth in the conversation. So saying, you know what, like that wasn't great, but I've done something similar in the past as well. And here's how I learned from that mistake. Here's a time when I might have said something that, offended so-and-so and how I grew from that. And we think that approach of pulling that person aside and having that kind of generous conversation with them is going to really help them learn and move past those mistakes much more effectively than just immediately deciding that they should be cast aside.
Right, and I can't help but share with you my approach to this because once I did a workshop, actually, I developed a workshop on microaggressions for a diversity committee I was part of a couple of years ago called Let's Talk Microaggressions. And it was geared towards all the students at NYU. And after I did a workshop, a person who attended the workshop, she had a follow-up session with me because she wanted to unpack some of the stuff that came up for her during the workshop. And she told me that it's very difficult for her to actually engage when people are either targeting her with microaggressions and or somebody else she knows, and it's just really difficult to talk about it for her. So she often just either shuts down, ignores it, and later on just feels really bad for not doing anything about it. And I told her that one of the things that I have learned from my work of doing this, first being at the end of receiving microaggressions and or targeted comments or any kind of discriminatory behavior, and or doing this work and calling people out while doing this for a career, like professional work, is that it always needs practice. Every time we do it, it's the same idea of the muscle. We need to grow into these conversations, and every time you will feel uncomfortable, but you go into a different point in the video game. It's like you rise to a different level. That's another metaphor I'm using. It's like I advance to different levels through
Yes.
my own practice of dealing with the discomfort and the anger and the disappointment and the emotions and everything that I work with to become better at addressing it the next time. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think there
I,
is something in that that
I love that. And I love the idea of going up the levels, because there's never a time where you get to, I guess here's where it differs a little bit from the video game, is there's never the time where you get to the very end and you can say, all right, good, I've made it, I'm done now, I'm perfect. I know how to have these conversations and they're never going to go wrong. Like these
like the
conversations
Mario
are going
Brothers that keeps on coming up with endless
to
stuff. No one finishes it. It just goes on and on.
but crucially, as you say, you can move up the levels. So that's the main thing, is improvement. Yeah.
Right, never-ending improvement and that dynamic ability, just like everything else in life. You just don't get perfect. You need
Yes.
to work at getting better. Then there's a new challenge, new processing unit that comes up for us to deal with that we need to
Exactly.
professionally develop for. And we're metaphoring our way through this interview. So,
A new mushroom to jump over or something, or whatever it is. Yeah.
exactly. So, so tell me a little bit about what should we do if we witness, because I think that's a really important thing that I would want my audience to deal with, the bystander angle, right? What should we do if we witness an identity conversation going wrong, such as someone being treated poorly by someone else because of their race or gender and any other form of intersectional identity? And how should we decide whether to involve ourselves and how to involve ourselves? Some advice on that.
Yeah, great question. So I think firstly, it's important for people to think about their motives for stepping into a situation like this, right? It's very easy for allies to jump into situations because they want to show people how virtuous they are and what a great ally they are, or they want cookies, to sort of say, oh my goodness, what an amazing person you are that you stepped into this situation. So I think first of all, ask yourself, am I doing this because I genuinely have a contribution to make to sort of help deal with this situation and contribute to a more inclusive culture? Or am I doing this because I want people to see how virtuous I am? And if it's the latter, you might want to kind of rethink whether to step into the situation. But assuming that your motives are strong, I think the next thing to think about is, does the affected person want my help in this situation? So often I think people do want help, but sometimes they don't, because it could actually suggest that they can't hack it on their own and that you're swooping in as their savior in that situation. So, there's studies in psychology. I'm thinking of work by Monica Schneider, where she had white peers give unsolicited help on a word puzzle to Black students who were trying to complete the same word puzzle. And she found that offering that unsolicited help actually made them feel worse about themselves, like made them feel less competent in their own ability to complete the task, because these people were coming in and suggesting that they don't know how to do it on their own. And so I think just stopping to think about, is this a situation where my help would actually be welcome here is an important first step. And then second is to think about, what kind of help would be helpful in this situation, right? So oftentimes we barrel in and impose our own vision of what kind of help might be best, rather than really listening to what the needs of the other person are in that setting. And so there's a great study by the psychologist Katie Wang about disability, where she asks you to imagine a blind woman, Mary, who's trying to navigate her way to work using a white cane, but she finds that her usual path to the bus stop is obstructed by a construction project. And so she turns to a pedestrian and asks for directions to the bus stop. She presents the participants in this study with two scenarios. In one scenario, the pedestrian says, "It's too dangerous for you to be walking on your own," and tells Mary to go home. In the second scenario, the pedestrian says, "It's too dangerous for you to be walking on your own. Let me accompany you to the bus stop." And that person takes Mary by the hand and accompanies her to the bus stop. Now, what they found in that study was that the participants who were not blind themselves usually found that second form of help to be much better, because it actually gave Mary ultimately took Mary to the bus stop. Whereas the blind participants in the study thought that both of those forms of help were almost equally inappropriate, because even the second form of help was patronizing. It made it out like Mary doesn't know how to get there on her own. It violated her bodily autonomy by grabbing her arm and pulling her to the bus stop. And what that person really should have done is just listen to what Mary was saying. It was the help that she really wanted, which was just directions to get to the bus stop and actually give them that help that they need. So I think it's really important for allies when they're stepping into situations to either ask the person what kind of help might be helpful for them to give, or at the very least, if they can't ask directly in the situation, to really give thought in an informed way to what form of help this other person might want from you, rather than just imposing the form of help that you think might be most helpful.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize this enough that I agree with you on this, because this is so important to implement for us to be learning to become comfortable in asking people questions politely about wanting to know what they would like to know. And I talk about this again with the work that I do with those I work with on these, that we need to stop treating people as texts, as predisposed scripts that we have written in our heads that we think we know what they want. And instead we need to actually make the effort and really go that extra mile, which is not really even that hard, to just have a basic conversation without assuming that what is it that you want, like without making those assumptions, and not treating people like a text, and instead treating people like the unique, difference-oriented being that they are, that's sitting in front of you. So
Yeah, and that
that's very important to me.
Yeah, and that's so much of the essence of this work of DEIB, right? Because, I think everyone's familiar with the golden rule of treating other people as you would want to be treated. I think
Yes.
one of the challenges of DEIB is that other people are so different from us. And so the way that you might want to be treated is not the way necessarily that someone else wants to be treated. And it's so important to think about helping people not as you might want to be helped, but as they want to be helped in that situation.
Right. Absolutely. So, a couple of last questions. So, in this time of intense polarization that we're facing in the United States as well as globally, as we see with so many changes of power, of leadership, etc., that's really becoming polarized in many ways. Many people have given up on conversation, believing it's more important to smite the enemy than to empathize with them. Why do you continue to have faith in the art of conversation?
Well, the main reason that I have faith in it is because that is where everybody actually has the opportunity to make influence in their own lives, right? So most people are not going to have an opportunity in their life unless they decide to run for office to, actually make direct policy change in a legislative body, or to become a judge, or even to become like a corporate, CEO or someone on the board who sets policy for an organization. Whereas every single person in society has opportunity to change people's lives in those daily interactions that they have with their family, with their friends, with their colleagues at work, and so on, right? So a lot of these conversations are so powerful and so transformative for people, even when they're happening on a micro level, right? So, I experienced this myself as a gay person coming out, of those little interactions that you have with people, whether you signal that you accept the other person or whether you reject the other person, that has lifelong implications for that person. And so I think people need to realize the power that these conversations have in the lives of the people that they're affecting. And that's both scary to realize the power that they have, but also I think quite empowering, because it means even if you are not the leader of an organization or a politician or a what have you, you can still influence how people feel in your environment, whether people belong, whether people feel included, every single day when you're speaking with other people as you go about your life. And so that's why I still kind of have faith in this, because I really feel like it's one of the only tools that everyone, no matter their position inside an organization or their station in life, can really be effective at implementing.
Yeah, it can be a very transformative experience in many different ways. The ability to have conversations and being able to do it well and to make the change, unfortunately, sometimes very negatively, as you said, with lifelong impact. And on the other hand, the positive kind of lifelong impact, because I feel some of the turning points in my life have been some inspiring conversation with some people that I've just met, for example, and it just like
Yeah,
sort of clicked, and then there was a domino effect of getting into a space of either doing something that was out of a momentary conversation of inspiration, and or having someone say something really unpleasant to you, however insignificant and however long time ago, and that defining your sense of something about either
absolutely.
yourself or someone else. Or, and for me, being a communication scholar, I feel that it extends to the responsibility that people have about the conversation about media and what we represent on the
Yeah,
screen. It has the same type of power where, for some people, you don't even have someone to talk to, but what you do is you're talking with your TV shows or your movies that you're watching and the narratives
yeah.
that you're following on screen. And so much of your understanding of the world and everything you have around you and inside of you and who you are can be about conversations that you hear between characters on TV shows or something. So there's
Absolutely.
that sort of media angle as well, because I can't leave that out. That's very important as well.
Yeah, and I think, all of us have had that experience of remembering things that someone has said to us, whether it's a teacher or a friend or someone on a TV show, even years and years and years ago, that have really shaped who we are, who we consider ourselves to be in the world, who have changed our lives. And so I think what I would love more people to realize is that every day they have the power to make that impact on someone that they're speaking to. I mean, obviously, they're not going to make that lasting impact in every single conversation that they have, but that is the power that we all carry with us.
So I'd like to ask you a question to end the show, which is, what is some advice you would want to give to anyone who wants to break into doing diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging work, especially from an identity that is uh, historically historically not associated with the field of DEIB. For example, you identify as a white male, and I would like to know how your experience and advice has been as a white male in a field about that is largely serving and doing discussions around historically marginalized groups.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, I've thought about this a lot. I strongly believe that the work of DEIB is work that all of us ought to be doing, and that it shouldn't just be work that people from historically marginalized backgrounds are doing. Because so often this work is given to people only to do if they belong to marginalized identities and backgrounds. And I think in order to create a more just and inclusive society, each of us has to play our role in that, including white men, right? Like, why should we get away with being able to just carry on and do other jobs and things or whatever that we want to do and not have to think about these important issues of diversity, equity, inclusion? So I think the advice that I would give to any other people who do belong to, I guess, more historically advantaged social groups that are interested in doing this work is it's really important to remain humble and realize all the areas and gaps in knowledge that you have on issues. So if I can just take a really simple example of this, say you don't have a disability yourself, if you're talking with someone who does have a disability, let's say they're a wheelchair user, that person is going to bring so much more knowledge to the table from their own life experience that you lack as someone who doesn't use a wheelchair. So they're going to know what areas in their neighborhood have curb cuts or ramps, which areas are hard to navigate, what biases they have to overcome, what works and doesn't work to challenge the bias that people have against people with disabilities. They're going to also know a lot about the assumptions and stereotypes of non-disabled people that get applied to people with disabilities. Unless you have a disability, you're often not going to know that information, right? Like, you're just, because it's not part of your daily experience. And so I think anyone who's trying to do this work who belongs to, who's say a white man or belongs to some advantaged background, I think it's really, really critical to be humble and curious and realize that your own perspective, you're bringing something to the table, but there is a vast, vast, vast universe of knowledge and experience out there that you can't tap into. And so you're going to need to really have a lot of conversations with people to learn about how they experience the world, right? Real conversations, but also listening to podcasts and reading books and really getting familiarized with how other people experience the world. Because I think there's a tendency when you belong to an advantaged social group to think that your own perspective is like the objective perspective on issues, and that's absolutely not the case. And so I think that's the strongest advice that I would give someone.
Right, which circles back to the comment that you made earlier, that it's not about that comment about treating others like you treat on what you want, because what you want is one perspective of, and may not have any relevance or anything to do with what others want or any other
Yes.
person. You can't center the world's understanding on what you consider to be your experience and your preferences. So,
Exactly.
Right. So what are some of your upcoming projects personally, and plans with the book as well as the Meltzer Center? Tell us a little bit about your plans coming up.
Yeah, so we're going to have a lot of, events and hopefully media and so on around the book. And one of the big projects that we want to work on in the book is how to actually translate the book content into more educational programming. And so we're doing a lot of work as a center of thinking about how can we turn this content that's currently in a book form into bite-sized modules that people can take if they want to kind of embed that learning more in their work, say with organizations. And so that's one of our big kind of upcoming projects. And then more generally, as a center, we're working on a reboot of a project that relates to authenticity in the workplace. So an entirely separate stream of work that we do as a center relates to the idea of covering, which is my colleague Kenji Yoshino's concept of ways that we minimize or downplay our outsider identities to blend into the mainstream. So all the pressure that we might feel in an environment to be less authentic because we feel like we have to conform to some norm in that environment. And we're doing a collaboration right now with Deloitte on rebooting that, some research in that area. And so I think this focus on pushing out the book content more widely, and then this focus on how to build more authenticity in the workplace are going to be two key themes for the center in 2023.
Very, very cool. Love both angles, and I'm sure you've talked about the book and turning it into bite-sized modules that you could also have little multimedia videos. I don't know if that's something you're interested in too.
Yes.
That will be amazing, so that people sort of have little independent little videos of your chapters and stuff to talk about it. That would be wonderful.
Great. Thank you.
Where can our audience go to follow your work and to find out about all the events and the updates on the book and the Meltzer Center, etc.?
Yeah, so if you just Google the Meltzer Center, it'll pop up with our website, and we have a little form that people can click on if they want to subscribe to our mailing list and get informed about the various events that we have going on. You can also find me, David Glasgow, on both Twitter and LinkedIn if you want to connect with me or follow me.
Sounds good. I hope you had a good time talking with us at Talking Out a Line, because I certainly had a really good conversation with you talking about conversations. And so thank you again for being at Talking Out a Line. And everyone, please go out and find out more about Saying the Right Thing by reading the book by David Glasgow. And of course, finding out about the amazing work that is happening in the center of Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at NYU. And also, we look forward to following your work in Twitter. And you said Twitter, and what was the other social media?
And LinkedIn, yeah.
Twitter and LinkedIn, so that we can follow up on sort of the ways in which your book evolves into its next phases. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.